All right, here we go, everybody. We're going to talk a little bit about forced and voluntary migrations. So these are two different types of migration. Voluntary is when people migrate due to their own choices, so voluntary choice. Involuntary is often called forced migration, where people relocate due to fears of violence or survival. So you saw this in the last video, but just as a reminder, we usually break down migration into international or internal. So in the last video, talked a little bit about the difference between interregional and intra-regional. So interregional, historical, rural to urban for jobs, and intra-regional is usually within urban areas from older cities to newer suburbs. So we usually see this internal migration of movement from older cities to newer suburbs in like stage 3 and 4 countries, and interregionally, this happens all over the world, but it's kind of a global phenomenon now. So today in this video, we're going to be looking at the top part of this, voluntary and forced migration. So we'll look at, the different aspects of voluntary migration, why people choose to move, and then people who are forced to leave. You've probably heard of refugee status or asylum seekers. We'll break that down in this video too. So this is one of those things in AP curriculum that comes up quite a bit. So any of my AP test takers, this is something that you're definitely going to want to know. People not taking the test, I don't know that you necessarily need to memorize this list, but it is kind of an interesting look at what are patterns, what are trends that we see about migration and migrants. So number one, migration is typically short in distance. Most people don't move very far. Most people don't want to move at all. Most people are interested in staying put unless there's a pull factor that entices them enough to leave, or a push factor that's going to push them away. But generally speaking, closer the better. It's just a more comfortable experience for people. A lot of times migration occurs in steps. You might move from one place to a next, especially when we're looking at anything that's related to forced migration. It usually isn't a neat and easy and clean process. Number three, urban areas attract both long distance and rural migrants. This is just a global phenomenon that the bigger the city, the more opportunities for people, and so we tend to see that rural migrants will move to their close cities, but also people from all over the world are going to be attracted to major cities. Number four, every migration generates a counter migration. So we have to be mindful that if people are leaving a particular place, where are they going to, and what are going to be the consequences for that place? There's usually going to be, kind of a process there it's a cause and effect relationship. Number five, men typically are the ones who move. I think I mentioned this in the last video, but women typically, we've noticed, migrate shorter distances. Men tend to migrate a longer distance, and this has mainly to do with traditional gender roles and who's going to provide for the family. Most people are leaving for economic reasons. They're going to be choosing that. Number six, most migration is due to economic factors. So there you go, just mentioned that. Okay, so types of voluntary migration. Now, whenever you see the little R, that's going to be, look for that, because that's an indication that it applies to Ravenstein's laws of migration. So types of voluntary migrations are as follows. Transnational, that means international. Transhumance, we'll get into what that means. Internal, chain, step, guest worker, and rural to urban. So let's break those down. As I mentioned, transnational migration from one country to another country. Immigrants to a new country retain strong cultural, emotional, and financial ties to their country of origin. Remittances, this is a great vocabulary word to know. Maybe you've heard this in the news lately. This is when money is sent back to migrants' country of origin. So this is a major economic flow. We see that a lot in Latin America and North America. So major flows of remittances from Latin America, from North America to Latin America, Southwest Asia to Europe, and Asia to North America. Some other examples. Internal migration is our second type of voluntary migration. This is when people travel within a country's borders. So it's much more likely than any sort of international migration or transnational migration. So another vocabulary word for you, distance decay. The farther apart two places are, the less likely it is that people will migrate between those two places. So we mentioned the Rust Belt last time, Rust Belt to Sun Belt migration. This is when factories closed in the industrial Northeast and Midwest. The pull factor, lower taxes, inexpensive land, nice weather. So people were moving. Transhumance. This is very common in Africa as well as especially Eastern Europe. This is when nomadic herders move their livestock. So it's seasonal based. And you can see a map here. What it's showing is that during dry seasons and wet seasons, there's movement to get herds into areas that are going to be suitable for their grazing. Chain migration. Immigrants migrate to a location based off of the recommendation of or reunification of family members, friends, or community members that have previously migrated to that location. And step migration. So here we go. Migration occurs in steps. So it's not easy. It's not an easy process most often. It happens due to intervening obstacles and opportunities. So intervening opportunities and obstacles, it sounds just what it is. So what gets in the way or what provides something that might prevent somebody from ending up in their kind of original last destination. So an example here, migration from a rural area to a city, then a larger city, and then finally to a metropolis. Another voluntary migration example, rural to urban. The most kinds of migration are this type. About 55% of people live in urban areas today. So we're seeing this across the world. And this is primarily due to economic push and pull factors. So fewer jobs in rural areas, more jobs in urban areas. A guest worker is a migrant who travels internationally in order to find work as a temporary laborer. So you saw some examples of that when you analyze some population pyramids, perhaps. Anytime you see kind of a jet out of a particular working age men, for instance, this is a great example or great insight into the guest worker phenomenon. So here we go, involuntary types of migration. So this is when people are forced to leave. So we have 4 different types. We have refugees, internationally or internally displaced persons, asylum seekers, and enslaved persons. All right, so refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. There is a specific definition that is used, and this all came about after World War II. Obviously there were people in Nazi Germany who were being persecuted, and so the United Nations established this system that created legal protections, human rights legal protections for people who have been victims of persecution. So causes, of course, war, ethnic, tribal, religious violence, environmental disasters. Today, you can see on the map here where we see the majority of refugees by country. And Syria, of course, is man, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen lots of violence in Syria, massive migration. You're going to do kind of a case study on that as well. Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar are other examples that have come up recently. Internally displaced persons, it's exactly what it sounds like. So someone who's been forced to flee their home but never cross an international border, so they remain internal. This is all the same causes of refugees. It just doesn't involve crossing an international border. So you can see here where the dot, this is an example of a graduated symbol map. So each of those dots indicates where we see a high percentage of people in that particular place. All right, and then asylum seekers, here's another kind of something that's going to differentiate somebody from a refugee. So when people flee their own country and seek sanctuary, seek protection in another country, they apply for asylum, or the right to be recognized as a refugee, and receive legal protection and material assistance. So an asylum seeker must demonstrate that there's fear, that there's well-founded risk of returning home. And this is kind of a cool graphic here. You can see, where the countries of origin are that I showed you on the last slide. So Syria's at the top, then we've got Venezuela, Afghanistan, and you can see where they are moving to. So Syria, large percentage moved to other parts of Southwest Asia, which is Middle East, and then also into Europe, especially kind of Central Europe. Oh, and here, just so you can see a little bit bigger. Okay, and then the last type of involuntary migration are enslaved persons. And of course, we know the historical example, the Atlantic slave trade during the 16th and 19th centuries. It's projected that 10 to 12 million people crossed the Atlantic, were forced into enslavement from West Africa. The majority of those people ended up migrating to, be forced to migrate to Central and South America. Very few actually were brought to the United States in proportion. But of course, then there was a lot of movement and trading of people too. But interestingly, we think about slavery as being a thing of the past, and it really isn't. Today, the United Nations estimates that about 21 million people are enslaved today. Wow, right? So oftentimes, this is called human trafficking. Maybe that's a word you've heard of. But it's still a thing here, people. We've got to be aware of that. But you can see where human trafficking is more common. The red, I'm looking at the bottom map here, the red is 5 million or more people living in modern day slavery or human trafficking. And there are a whole host of reasons for human trafficking that you can, if you're interested in this, you can look up on your own, but it is not an easy thing. So sorry for that really, really uplifting lesson here on forced migration, voluntary migration. Spend a little time analyzing the Syrian refugee crisis. It is super important. We'll do a little bit on the U.S. immigration policy of late, and think about what's the future going to look like in our lifetime. Thanks for watching, everybody.